The NBA in 2013 was strange. The Heat just won their second straight title. They and the Thunder and Spurs were at the top of the league. The rest of the league was not nearly as talented as it is now, with David Lee, Rudy Gay, J.R. Smith all being in the top 20 in points per game. And going into the 2013 draft, the vibe around the class was uncertainty. There were a few big players that everyone was keeping an eye on at the top. Victor Oladipo, an athletic two-way guard that was on the shorter side and wasn't a great shooter, but had plenty of upside. Cody Zeller, a skilled post big that was seen as a top pick during his freshman season the year before at Indiana, before deciding to return to school and then enter the draft in 2013. Ben McLemore, the super talented scoring guard that was one of the best shooters in the class, even drawing some Ray Allen comparisons. Alex Len, who leading up to the draft had multiple mocks putting him down as the first pick in the draft for some reason. I mean, he was kind of big and mobile, I guess. And lastly, Nerlens Noel, who was seen as the top prospect during most of the college season before a really rough knee injury and complete lack of offensive game put his NBA future in serious doubt. So yeah, that's the top of the 2013 NBA draft. A handful of okay, but very flawed prospects, and not a single person knew how any of the top 5 picks would go, even all the way up to the night of the draft. The first pick of the draft belonged to the Cleveland Cavaliers, who were a few years removed from LeBron leaving them the first time, and had put together a slightly interesting young group of talent led by Kyrie Irving, and also including Tristan Thompson and Dion Waiters. They finished with the third worst record in the league the year before, so they really needed anything they could get, and the player that they picked, even in a draft where literally nobody knew what would happen and everyone was prepared for weirdness, shocked everyone.
Anthony Bennett.
Anthony Bennett, the worst first overall pick in the history of basketball, goes number 1 overall to the Cavs, and even at the time, that was so strange. There is a reason that I didn't mention him in the beginning where I went through all the big name players before this draft, and that's because he simply wasn't one. There was some interesting stuff from him in college, most notably being pretty agile at his size and showing some occasional high upside scoring skill, but he was seen as a top 7 to 12 prospect in a very weak draft, and almost nobody thought that he would go first. The Cavs were also desperately trying to move out of this pick because even they knew that Bennett shouldn't go there, but obviously they couldn't find any takers. What didn't make any sense at all was drafting Bennett, who scored 217 total points on 35% shooting from the field in his one season with Cleveland as the number 1 overall pick. Both of those marks are worse than even the infamous Kwame Brown as a rookie. Bennett is without question the worst first overall pick in NBA history, and maybe even in the history of sports. But fortunately for the vibes of this video, things get much better with the second overall pick. The Orlando Magic held this selection, and they just finished up their first full season after trading away Dwight Howard and managed only 20 wins. They had a young Tobias Harris and Nikola Vucevic, both of which were already looking like interesting pieces, as well as veteran tradable pieces like Aaron Aflalo. But clearly they needed a talent upgrade and someone that looked at least a little bit like a franchise player. They went with Victor Oladipo, who, if he could refine his offensive skill, could blossom into an all-star perimeter creator, or worst case become a solid 2-guard to support whatever star the Magic eventually drafted. And all in all, this is one of the best picks at the top of what was a very bad draft, even if Oladipo's best years as a pro happened outside of Orlando. And given everybody that the Magic could have realistically picked here, he was their best option, as he is the only player in the top 14 picks of this draft that made an all-star team, and he also made All-NBA as well. And he's one of only 3 players in the entire draft that made even just one all-star team in their careers. Picking third were the Washington Wizards, and they were in desperate search of a third star alongside their incredibly talented young backcourt duo of John Wall and Bradley Beal. It was very clear even at this point that Beal and Wall would develop into really good players, but the third best guy on the team in 2013 was Martell Webster? Point being, the Wizards needed to hit on this pick, and this was one spot where there was actually a good amount of certainty heading into the draft. Most people expected Otto Porter Jr. to still be there at 3, and for the Wizards to pick him. Porter was seen as a high-floor complementary prospect that likely wouldn't become a high-level all-star, but should be able to guard and shoot and create just enough to be considered a solid starter in the league. And although that might not sound inspiring, it honestly wasn't an awful choice to go with the high-floor player in such a bad draft. And despite a lot of hate from fans because of some big contracts that he signed, Porter mostly lived up to his draft evaluation in his career. He never became an all-star level player, but was really underrated as a shooter and a nice complement alongside Wall and Beal. A solid choice given their options at the time. On to the 4th pick now, where the Charlotte Bobcats, yes, Bobcats, were selecting. They had Kemba Walker, who looked like a solid scoring guard, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, who they picked a year before at 2nd overall, and we hadn't all realized how terrible he was yet, and also Bismack Biyombo, Gerald Henderson. They somehow won 21 games the year before, but I feel like in today's NBA, this roster would have won like 9 games. They ended up with Cody Zeller, a selection that a lot of people actually really liked at the time. It might be strange to hear now, but people really liked Cody Zeller in college. He was a skilled big that could score in the post, and we hadn't quite gone away from that version of bigs in the NBA yet. The weird thing was, they picked Zeller and then immediately signed Al Jefferson in free agency, a skilled big that could score in the post exclusively. Seriously, having Al Jefferson on your team meant that when he's out there, he's getting the ball in the post almost every single time down the floor. And he was good. He made an All-NBA team in his first year with the Bobcats, but if they were going to sign him, why pick Zeller in the first place? Why not someone like Ben McLemore to pair his scoring with Kemba? To be fair, there was a run on bigs over the next few picks here, so maybe the rest of the league just liked the big guys better than the guards as a whole at this point in the draft, but it still seems strange. Zeller was the definition of fine in his time in Charlotte, never reaching anything close to the scoring potential some people thought that he had as a prospect. 5th overall now, we have yet another team transitioning to a new era, the Phoenix Suns. They just finished their first season without Steve Nash on the team after trading him to the Lakers in 2012, and their 25-win season behind Goran Dragic, the Morris twins, and Morrison Gortat earned them a top 5 pick in an awful draft. Really, the Suns just needed talent here, so they went with a guy that, as I established earlier, some mocks had going 1st overall, Alex Len, who at his peak was a durable 20-minute per game backup 5. Moving on now to the far more interesting part of the draft, 6th overall. Going into draft night, this pick was held by the 2012-13 New Orleans Hornets, but soon to be the 2013-14 New Orleans Pelicans. They won 27 games in Anthony Davis's rookie season, surrounded by a core of Eric Gordon, Ryan Anderson, and Al-Farouq Aminu. Not great, but it was already clear how awesome Davis was going to be, and when healthy, the surrounding pieces weren't awful. However, the night of the draft, the Pelicans decided to jumpstart their rebuild by sending the 6th pick and a 2014 first to the Philadelphia 76ers for Drew Holiday. Holiday was only 22 years old, but was immediately the best player on the roster while Davis developed, and really the only reason this trade didn't work out better for the Pelicans is because Holiday didn't play a ton of games his first few years with the team. The Sixers, meanwhile, had the opposite idea of the Pelicans. They won just 34 games the year before behind Holiday, Evan Turner, and Thaddeus Young, but pretty clearly had no upside to be a high-level team. And with new members of the front office in charge, Sam Hinkie began the tank fest that was the process, and it all began with this trade. They went from a middle-of-the-pack team to a sub-20 win team for 3 straight years after this trade, which was all part of the plan. Another piece of that plan was to draft high upside players, which they certainly did by selecting Nerlens Noel 6th overall. Had Noel never hurt his knee at Kentucky, he would have been the first pick in this draft. He was an incredibly talented defensive player that played with great energy and was the only thing remotely close to a sure thing that this draft had to offer at the top. Unfortunately for him, his career never really got started. He did have some interesting moments, especially defensively, but this era of the Sixers was an incredibly difficult place to start an NBA career with the constant losing and lack of overall development, not to mention that the Sixers drafted 2 more bigs in consecutive drafts after Noel's, Joel Embiid in 2014 and Jahlil Okafor in 2015. Noel never really got comfortable playing alongside the other bigs that Philly brought in, and the Sixers gave up on him after just a few seasons. I honestly believe that, 1, the fact that Embiid survived the process and became an MVP just shows how incredible of a player he is, and 2, Noel getting hurt and then landing in Philly were the 2 worst things that could have happened to him to start his NBA career. He had the talent to be an all-defensive team level center and a good to great rim roller, which is good enough to make plenty of money as a pro, but it just wasn't meant to be, which means that his legacy is more about the trade than anything else. Next up is 7th overall, which was held by the, at the time, still very sad Sacramento Kings. They had DeMarcus Cousins and not much else for the future of their roster. Technically, they had Tyreek Evans and Isaiah Thomas, but neither of them helped them much moving forward. Cousins, however, despite his flaws, already looked like a future All-NBA caliber player and was becoming a devastating offensive force, so the Kings wanted to add a dynamic backcourt scorer to complement him, and that's exactly what they thought they were getting with Ben McLemore at 7 overall. And plenty of smart draft people loved this guy as a prospect. They were Ray Allen comparisons. Some people thought he was the most talented player in the draft. He was athletic, a great shooter, could create his own shot, and was a really productive player at Kansas the year before. What people missed a little bit, though, was that he was actually a bit older as a college player, despite technically being a freshman, and turned 21 during the All-Star break of his rookie season, and that's likely why he was so productive and looked so good at Kansas and was never able to keep up that level in the NBA. Moving on, and at 8th overall is a really solid bright spot from this draft. The Pistons had this pick, and their 29-win team featured the young core of Greg Monroe, Andre Drummond, and Brandon Knight. During this offseason after the draft, they actually swapped Knight and Chris Middleton for Brandon Jennings and also signed Josh Smith to a huge contract to play alongside Monroe and Drummond for some reason, who really knows. But with this pick, they went with Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who despite his best years being outside of Detroit, was a really good pick here. There were even rumors of him getting a max contract offer once his rookie deal was done with the Pistons. Yes, that was a real thing, but ended up on the Lakers, Wizards, and then Nuggets. He never became an all-star, but a serviceable 3-and-D wing with a little bit of driving ability is a really solid pick at this point in this draft. Number 9 now, and it gets kind of weird. The Timberwolves held this pick, but actually traded back with the Jazz, something that doesn't really happen all that often. They got the 14th and 21st picks in this draft in exchange for 9, and the Jazz picked guard Trey Burke out of Michigan, who just had an incredible run in the NCAA tournament. His shot making and creation was unbelievable during that stretch, and despite being a smaller guard, the Jazz took a chance on him being the point guard that they needed, with their front court pretty much being set with Gordon Hayward, Derek Favors, and Enes Kanter. They were a solid 43-win team the year before this draft, but were going young after losing Al Jefferson in free agency. Burke did basically nothing for the Jazz or really any other team simply because he would have needed to be an incredible offensive player to make up for his lack of size. But on the bright side, the Jazz didn't really give up much in the trade anyway, just Sabaz Muhammad at 14 and Gorgui Dieng at 21, neither of which I'm going to cover in this video. Interestingly, the Jazz are going to get a huge piece in this draft just a little bit later on. At number 10 now is the absolute steal of this draft if a certain MVP didn't exist. The Trailblazers had this pick and actually had a really strong core of LaMarcus Aldridge, Nick Batum, Wes Matthews, and Rookie of the Year Damian Lillard. And despite winning just 33 games, this was a solid team. They were right around 500 near the end of the year before intentionally losing 13 straight games to end the season to tank their way into the lottery, and they did well with that choice. They ended up with CJ McCollum, the small school darling from Lehigh that had some great moments of his own in the NCAA tournament. McCollum basically became what the Jazz thought Trey Burke might be, a great shot creator and maker despite being a smaller guard. Interestingly, though, it took McCollum some time to really become the player we know now, as he had some injury issues and it took him some time to earn the trust of the coaching staff. Ultimately, even after losing LaMarcus Aldridge in free agency, the Trailblazers would go on to make the conference finals with their backcourt of Lillard and McCollum, a sustained stretch of success that wouldn't have been possible without this pick. Speaking of Rookie of the Year Damian Lillard, the Rookie of the Year from this class comes from the 11th pick. The Sixers were picking here with what ended up being their second first-round pick of the night. We covered that situation earlier, and they went with big guard Michael Carter-Williams from Syracuse, and this guy had a crazy start to his career. He was putting up triple-doubles, flashing a weird, big playmaking guard-type game that was truly unique, but in hindsight, we probably should have all seen that it was kind of fool's gold. The Sixers really prioritized him offensively to see what they had in him during the process, which inflated his stats. Not to mention the fact that he couldn't shoot at all, so him being a complimentary player on a good team was out of the question as well. So he wins the Rookie of the Year award, and then halfway through his second season, the Sixers dump him to the Bucks. One of the weirdest careers ever. The funny part about this is the Sixers got a first-round pick from Phoenix in the trade, which became Mikal Bridges, who the Sixers then traded back to Phoenix on draft night for basically nothing. So the Sixers could have turned Carter-Williams into Bridges, who is the exact kind of player the process Sixers have always needed if they just held on to the pick. Speaking of trade pieces, this next pick is a big one. The Thunder were picking 12th despite winning 60 games the year before. They were clearly one of the best teams in the league behind Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, but a first-round knee injury cost Westbrook all but 2 games of his 2013 postseason, leading to a disappointing second-round exit for OKC. But they had a great core of KD, Russ, Reggie Jackson, and Serge Ibaka, but notably missing from that list is, of course, James Harden, who they traded the offseason before for a lot of different reasons, and is the reason why they had the 12th pick in the first place. What makes that trade even weirder is that this pick is really the only significant piece that they got in return for Harden in the long term. At 12, the Thunder picked Steven Adams, who did take some time to develop into a starting caliber center, but was a really solid player for them for a long time and was the 5 that they were searching for the entirety of the Durant era. He just didn't quite turn into that guy until after Durant left, unfortunately for them. And now we get to one of the greatest draft picks of all time. The Milwaukee Bucks were picking 15th and were about to change the entire trajectory of their franchise. They won 38 games the year before, but they honestly have no idea how. They had Monte Ellis, who they got in the Andrew Bogut trade with the Warriors, and as I mentioned earlier, they added Brandon Knight for Brandon Jennings during this offseason. But it was clear that they weren't very talented, which was made even more clear by the fact that they won just 15 games in the season immediately after this draft. But with this pick and this offseason as a whole, the Bucks created a championship team. Giannis Antetokounmpo falls to them at 15th, the mystery man of this draft. The physical talent with him was clear, and a high upside swing in a bad draft is never a bad idea. The thing was, Giannis went from an interesting late first round prospect to maybe going early 20s to almost a lottery pick. If he didn't go 15th, the Hawks would have taken him at 17, and they nearly traded up in front of the Bucks to go and get Giannis. But make no mistake about it, this was a risk, and nobody had any idea if he would be good or not. There was talent, but he was about as far away from being a usable NBA player as you could possibly be at the time that he was picked, while still going in the first round. What the other teams in the draft didn't anticipate, though, was Giannis's work ethic and his size. He actually grew multiple inches after being drafted and is a notoriously hard worker, pushing himself from interesting rookie to starter to all-star to an MVP and one of the best players in the league. I could honestly do a whole 30-minute video on the story of Giannis another day, but his path to the league is simply incredible, as was this entire offseason for the Bucks. Even though it didn't seem like it immediately, again, 15 wins the season right after this, the Bucks don't come close to winning the 2021 title without this offseason. They get Giannis, of course, but they also steal Chris Middleton away from the Pistons, who at the time was basically just a throw-in in a trade, and developed him into an all-star. Just an absolute dream offseason for Milwaukee. One more pick to cover here, and it is a big one, literally. At 27th overall, the Denver Nuggets were selecting, and they had just won 57 games before falling apart in the playoffs, and for some reason, decided to basically just sell their first-round pick. They got a second-round pick and some cash, while the Jazz moved up to 27 and picked Rudy Gobert. As disliked as he is now, Gobert was incredible value with the 27th pick. One of the best defensive players in the league, and even though it took a few years to get to that level, he eventually pushed out the entirety of the young and much higher drafted front court of Derek Favors and Enes Kanter in Utah, while also completely outplaying the much higher drafted pick within this exact draft, Trey Burke, who the Jazz traded up for at 9. And that really is the theme of the 2013 draft. Without picks 15 and 27, it's the second worst draft of all time and in contention for the worst ever. If Giannis and Gobert didn't develop into who they did, this draft would have produced exactly one all-star caliber player, Victor Oladipo, and a handful of solid starters, and that's about it. One of the weirdest, dumbest, craziest drafts we've ever seen. The 2013 draft is also one of my favorites.